Have you ever wondered what happened to someone you once loved? That person who disappeared from your life without explanation. I never thought I'd see Marcus again. We were supposed to get married. Build a life together, create the future we'd drawn up on coffee-stained napkins in college. But 5 years ago, he vanished. No goodbye, no explanation, just gone. Last Tuesday, I found him sleeping under a bridge downtown, wearing clothes I didn't recognize and a face I barely knew. What he told me in that moment changed everything I thought I knew about love, sacrifice, and the promises we make to the people we care about. This is our story, a story about the invisible burdens people carry and the devastating price of silence. My name is Sarah, and I'm 34 years old. 5 years ago, I thought I had my entire life figured out. Marcus and I had been together since our junior year at State University. We weren't one of those dramatic whirlwind romances you see in movies. Our love was steady, comfortable, the kind that grows slowly like a tree, roots deepening with every shared morning and whispered conversation in the dark. Marcus was an architect, brilliant in ways that made my chest tight with pride. He'd spend hours sketching buildings that seemed to defy gravity, structures that married beauty with purpose. I was a high school English teacher, and while our careers couldn't have been more different, we balanced each other perfectly. He built dreams in concrete and steel. I built them in words and ideas. We'd saved for 3 years to buy a small house on Maple Street, nothing fancy, but it was ours. The kitchen had yellow walls that Marcus promised to repaint, and there was a backyard where we'd planned to plant tomatoes and maybe, someday, build a swing set. We were engaged. The wedding was set for June. 8 months away, my mother had already bought her dress. His best friend had written a toast he kept threatening to read to us early. Life felt secure, predictable in the best possible way. We had Friday night rituals, Thai food and old movies. Saturday mornings, we'd go to the farmer's market and argue playfully about which vendor had the best honey. Sundays were for planning, for dreaming out loud about the children we'd have, the trips we'd take, the life we'd build together brick by brick. Marcus had recently landed the biggest project of his career, a community center for the east side of town. He'd competed against firms with 10 times his experience and somehow won. I remember the night he got the call. He picked me up and spun me around our tiny living room until we were both dizzy and laughing. That project was supposed to change everything for us. His firm would grow. We'd have the financial security we'd worked so hard for. The future was a door swinging wide open. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first, so subtle I convinced myself I was imagining it. Marcus started coming home later from work. When I'd ask about his day, his answers became vague, distracted. The light in his eyes, that spark that made him Marcus, began to dim like a bulb losing power. He stopped sketching at our kitchen table. He stopped talking about the community center. When I'd bring it up, he'd change the subject with a skill that felt practiced, rehearsed. I told myself it was stress. Big projects come with big pressure. I made his favorite meals, gave him space, tried to be the supportive partner I'd always been, but the distance between us grew wider each day. An invisible canyon I didn't know how to cross. He started sleeping on the couch, claiming he didn't want to wake me when he came home late. We stopped having our Friday nights. The farmer's market trips ended. He was living in our house, but no longer living in our life. I tried everything. I asked if he wanted to postpone the wedding. I suggested therapy. I begged him to talk to me, to tell me what was wrong, to let me help carry whatever weight was crushing him. But Marcus had become a stranger, wearing my fiancé's face, present in body, but absent in every way that mattered. Then, one morning in November, I woke up to find him gone. His clothes were still in the closet, his toothbrush still in the bathroom, his sketches still scattered across his desk, But Marcus was gone. No note, no text message, no explanation. Just an empty space where the man I loved used to be, and a silence so complete it felt like drowning. The first 48 hours after Marcus disappeared were the worst of my life. I called everyone, his parents, his brother, his colleagues. His college roommate who'd moved to Seattle. Nobody had heard from him. I filed a missing person report, and a bored detective took notes that felt more like checking boxes than actual investigation. Adult man, he said, barely looking up. No signs of foul play. Sometimes people just need space, but this wasn't space. This was abandonment. This was erasure. His phone went straight to voicemail. His email bounced back. It was as if Marcus had decided to delete himself from existence and took every trace of explanatio with him. I drove around the city for days, peering into coffee shops and parks, scanning crowds for his familiar walk, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking. I created social media posts with his picture. Begging for information, nothing. His firm was in chaos. Apparently, Marcus had stopped showing up to weeks before he left me something I hadn't known, because he'd kept leaving the house every morning like everything was normal. His boss, a kind woman named Patricia, told me that Marcus had seemed troubled but wouldn't say why. The community center project had stalled. Deadlines were missed. When she tried to reach him, he'd sent vague emails about personal issues and asked for time. Time for what? I wanted to scream. Time to destroy everything we'd built. His parents were devastated. His mother cried on my shoulder, and I found myself comforting her while my own heart was breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. His father, a stoic man who rarely showed emotion, looked 10 years older every time I saw him. We formed a strange grief circle, the three of us mourning someone who wasn't dead but might as well have been. The weeks turned into months. I couldn't afford the mortgage on my teacher's salary alone, so I sold the house on Maple Street. Each box I packed felt like burying another piece of our future. I moved into a small apartment downtown, started therapy, and tried to rebuild a life I'd never planned to live alone. Friends told me to move on, to accept that Marcus had made his choice. But how do you move on when you don't know what you're moving on from? I cancelled the wedding, returned the deposits, told family members there wouldn't be a June ceremony. My mother tried to be supportive, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes, not in Marcus for leaving, but in me for choosing him in the first place. That hurt almost as much as his absence. For the first year, I kept expecting him to come back. Every knock on the door made my heart race. Every unknown number calling my phone sent hope surging through my veins. But the calls were always telemarketers, and the knocks were always delivery drivers bringing packages for the woman I was trying to become, someone who existed independently of Marcus and our shattered plans. By year 2, the hope had hardened into anger. How dare he do this? How dare he make me love him and then disappear like I meant nothing? I imagined confrontations where I'd scream at him, demand answers, make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused. I imagined him begging for forgiveness I'd never give. By year 3, the anger had dulled into acceptance. I dated other people, nice men who took me to nice dinners and said nice things. None of them were Marcus, but maybe that was the point. I convinced myself I'd healed. I told my therapist I'd moved on. I almost believed it. Years 4 and 5 passed in a blur of routine, teaching, grading papers, small weekend trips with friends. I'd built a decent life from the rubble Marcus left behind. Not the life I'd planned, but a life nonetheless. I thought about him less frequently. Some days, hours would pass without his ghost sitting on my shoulder. I thought I was over it. I thought I'd never see him again. I thought the story was finished. I was wrong about all of it. Last Tuesday started like any other. I'd stayed late at school for parent-teacher conferences, and by the time I left, the sun had already set. My car was making a strange rattling noise I'd been ignoring for weeks. So I decided to take the bus home. The route ran through downtown, past the business district and into the older neighborhoods where buildings wore their age like badges of honor. The bus stopped at 5th and Madison, and that's when I saw him. Or rather, I saw someone who couldn't possibly be him, but somehow was. There's a small park there, if you can call it a park. More like a concrete triangle with a few struggling trees and benches that have seen better. Decades, homeless people often gathered there, and I'd walked past that corner hundreds of times without really seeing them. We never really see them, do we? They become part of the urban landscape, invisible in their visibility. But that night, something made me look. Maybe it was the way he was sitting hunched over with his elbows on his knees, staring at the ground, like it held answers. Maybe it was the familiar shape of his shoulders, even beneath layers of dirty clothing. Maybe it was fate or cruelty. Or whatever force in the universe decides that sometimes you have to face the very thing you've spent years running from. I pulled the stop cord so hard I nearly broke it. The bus driver gave me an annoyed look as the doors hissed open between stops. I stumbled onto the sidewalk, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. My legs moved without permission from my brain, carrying me across the street toward this person who couldn't be Marcus, but had to be Marcus. The closer I got, the more certain I became. And the more certain I became, the less I understood this homeless man sitting on a bench with holes in his shoes and a beard that swallowed his face had Marcus's hands, long fingers that used to sketch beautiful buildings. Hands that had held mine during movies, that had cooked me breakfast, that had touched me with tenderness I'd thought was permanent. Marcus, my voice came out strangled, barely a whisper. He didn't react. Marcus, louder this time. He looked up slowly, and when his eyes met mine, I saw recognition flash across his face, recognition followed immediately by something that looked like horror. He stood abruptly, the blanket he'd been wrapped in falling to the ground. For a moment, I thought he might run. Every muscle in his body seemed coiled for escape. Sarah. He said my name like it hurt, like it was a word in a language he'd forgotten how to speak. His voice was hoarse, damaged in a way that suggested screaming or silence or both. What happened to you? I couldn't process what I was seeing. This wasn't possible. Marcus came from a good family. He had a degree, skills, connections. People like Marcus didn't end up homeless. There had to be an explanation that made sense. Undercover journalism project, or temporary situation, or literally anything other than the obvious reality standing in front of me. You shouldn't be here. He looked around nervously, like my presence had exposed him to some danger I couldn't see. You need to go. Sarah, please, are you insane? I haven't seen you in 5 years. You disappeared from my life without a word. And now I'm supposed to just walk away. My voice was rising, attracting attention from others in the park. An older woman with a shopping cart full of belongings watched us with tired eyes that had seen every variation of human drama. I can't. He stopped, his jaw working like he was chewing words too difficult to swallow. I can't do this right now. Then when, Marcus, when can you do this? Another 5 years. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, they were wet. You were supposed to forget about me. You were supposed to move on and be happy. Well, I didn't, so talk to me. There was a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away, the kind of place where nobody asks questions, and everyone minds their own business. I'd offered to buy Marcus food, and after several minutes of him refusing and me insisting, he'd finally agreed. We walked in silence, maintaining a careful distance like we were strangers, which I suppose we were now. The fluorescent lights inside the diner were harsh, unforgiving. They illuminated every detail I'd been unable to see clearly in the park. Marcus was painfully thin, his cheekbones sharp enough to cast shadows. His clothes hung off him like they belonged to someone else, which they probably did. There were scars on his hands I didn't remember, and when he moved, he did so carefully, like someone whose body had learned to expect pain. We slid into a booth in the back corner. The plastic seat cracked beneath us. A waitress who looked like she'd stopped caring about anything years ago brought menus and coffee without being asked. Her name tag said Brenda, and she had the expression of someone who'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "Order whatever you want," I told Marcus, watching him stare at the menu like it was written in a foreign language. "I mean it, whatever you want." He ordered a hamburger, fries, and soup. When the food came, he ate slowly, deliberately, with the careful attention of someone who'd forgotten what it meant to know where the next meal was coming from. I watched him eat and felt tears burning behind my eyes. This was Marcus. This was the man who'd promised to love me forever, who'd picked out paint colors for our hypothetical children's rooms, who'd once driven to us in a snowstorm to bring me soup when I had the flu. "You're staring," he said quietly, not looking up from his plate. "What did you expect? You vanished from my life, and now you're—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Homeless, broken, a ghost wearing familiar skin." He set down his fork and finally met my eyes. "I never wanted you to see me like this. Then why did you leave? Why didn't you just tell me whatever was wrong? We could have figured it out together. That's what people who love each other do." "Marcus, they figure it out together." "No," his voice was firm, harder than I'd ever heard it. "No, some things you can't figure out. Some things you have to face alone, because bringing someone else into it would destroy them too." "What are you talking about?" Frustration was bleeding through my shock. What could possibly be so terrible that disappearing was the better option? Marcus looked toward the window, where the city lights blurred together like watercolors. "Do you remember how excited I was about the community center project?" "Of course I remember. You talked about it for months. It was going to change your career." "It did change my career, just not the way I expected." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. 3 weeks after I got the contract, I found out the project was being funded by the Costellano organization. The name meant nothing to me. I shook my head. "They're a crime family, Sarah. One of the biggest on the East Coast. The community center was a money laundering operation. Every dollar I spent, every beam I designed, every permit I filed, it was all dirty money being cleaned through my hands." I felt my stomach drop. "But you didn't know." "I didn't know at first," he interrupted. "But once I found out, they made it very clear I had two choices: keep working, keep quiet, and get paid, or refuse, and watch everyone I cared about suffer the consequences." The diner suddenly felt too small, too bright, too real. "You should have gone to the police. You think I didn't consider that?" His voice cracked. "These aren't people you go to the police about. These are people who own the police." Marcus stared into his coffee cup like he was reading tea leaves, trying to find a future that didn't end in disaster. The waitress came by and refilled our cups without speaking, her practiced movements suggesting she'd learned long ago not to interrupt serious conversations. "Tell me everything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "From the beginning." He took a breath that seemed to hurt. "The project manager they assigned to me was a guy named Vincent Costellano, nephew of the family boss. At first, everything seemed normal. He was professional, knowledgeable about construction. We'd have meetings, review plans, but about a month in, there was a budget meeting where the numbers didn't add up." Marcus explained how he'd noticed discrepancies, costs inflated by 30 or 40%, subcontractors being paid for work that hadn't been done, materials being ordered, and then mysteriously disappearing. When he'd raised concerns, Vincent had smiled and invited him to a private dinner. That's when they laid it out for me, Marcus continued, very calm, very polite. They told me exactly who they were and what the project was really for. They showed me photographs of my parents' house, of my brother's kids at school, of you at the high school where you taught. His hands were shaking now, coffee sloshing in his cup. They knew your schedule, Sarah, what time you left for work, which route you drove, where you got your morning coffee. The implications made my blood run cold. They threatened us. They didn't have to threaten. They just showed me the photographs and said it would be unfortunate if anything happened to people I cared about. Very unfortunate. Then Vincent patted me on the shoulder and said that as long as I did my job and kept my mouth shut, everyone would be safe. Everyone would be happy. I wanted to tell him he should have come to me immediately, but the words died in my throat. What could I have done? What could anyone have done against people with that kind of power? I tried to think of a way out, Marcus said. I spent weeks researching, making calls to anonymous tip lines, trying to find someone who could help. But everywhere I turned, I hit walls. These people had their fingers in everything: construction departments, police precincts, legal offices. The system that was supposed to protect people from exactly this kind of thing was working for them. He'd considered running away, he told me, taking me and disappearing to another state, changing our names, starting over. But they'd anticipated that too. Vincent had made it clear that if Marcus disappeared, his family would pay the price. His 68-year-old mother with her heart condition, his brother with 3 young children. They weren't making idle threats. They showed him news clippings about what happened to people who'd crossed them before, so I kept working. Marcus said, his voice hollow, every day I'd go to that site and oversee the construction of a building that was nothing but a monument to corruption. I'd sign off on fraudulent invoices. I'd meet with city officials who'd been paid off. And every night, I'd come home to you, and I'd have to pretend everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. I said softly I could tell something was wrong. No, I could see you watching me, worrying about me, and that made it worse because you were this good person, this pure thing in my life, and I was contaminating you just by being near you. Every time you touched me, I felt dirty, every time. You said you loved me, I felt like a fraud. The project took 8 months to complete, 8 months of Marcus living the double life, drowning in guilt and fear. 8 months of watching the woman he loved plan a wedding he knew couldn't happen. 8 months of calculating exactly how much damage his participation was causing and being powerless to stop it. When the building was finished, I thought maybe it would be over. He said, I thought maybe they'd pay me and let me go. I was so stupid. Vincent Costellano had taken Marcus to lunch the week after the community centre opened a nice Italian place downtown where the waiters knew Vincent by name and the owner personally brought wine to their table. Marcus had hoped this lunch was the end of their business relationship. He couldn't have been more wrong. They had another project for me, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. A residential development, luxury condos. 3 times the size of the community centre, which meant 3 times the money to launder. But this time, there was a condition. They wanted Marcus to open his own firm. They'd provide the capital, the clients, the connections. On paper, he'd be a successful independent architect. In reality, he'd be completely owned by the Costellano organization, a permanent fixture in their money laundering operation, I said. No, Marcus looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. For the first time, I stood up to them. I told Vincent I'd fulfilled my obligation, that I'd done what they asked, and now I wanted out. I was calm about it, professional, I thought. Maybe they'd respect that. Vincent's response had been to laugh. Not a cruel laugh, but something almost paternal, like Marcus was a child who'd said something adorably naive. Then the laughter stopped. And Vincent leaned across the table with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Here's the thing. Marcus, Vincent had said, you're not an innocent bystander anymore. You're complicit. We have 8 months of documentation showing you knowingly participated in financial fraud. We have your signature on false invoices. We have recordings of you meeting with city officials about permits you knew were fraudulent. If this ever goes to trial. You're not a victim, you're a co-conspirator. Marcus had felt the walls closing in. He'd spent 8 months trying to protect everyone he loved, and in doing so, he'd created a prison with no exit. They had me trapped, Marcus told me. His hands clenched into fists on the diner table. If I went to the police, I'd go to jail. If I refused to continue working for them, my family would be hurt, and if I kept working for them, I'd spend the rest of my life as their puppet. He'd gone home that night, our home, the house on Maple Street, and sat in his car for 2 hours, unable to go inside. He could see me through the kitchen window, grading papers at our table, occasionally looking up and smiling at something. On my laptop, I looked happy, I looked safe, I looked like everything good that still existed in his ruined life. That's when Marcus made his decision. The only decision that made sense in a situation where nothing made sense. I realized that, as long as I was connected to anyone, the Castellanos could use them as leverage, he said. My parents, my brother, his kids, but especially you. You were the pressure point they'd push hardest because you were the person I loved most. So Marcus developed a plan. It took him 2 weeks to arrange. He slowly moved his personal documents to a storage unit. He transferred money from their savings account in small amounts that wouldn't raise immediate suspicion. He wrote letters he'd never send, explaining everything. Begging for forgiveness. I needed to become no one, Marcus said. If I didn't exist, I couldn't be used to hurt anyone. If you believed I'd abandoned you, you'd move on. You'd be angry instead of worried. You'd heal and build a new life far away from any of this. So you just left, I said. Struggling to process the enormity of what he was describing. You made everyone who loved you think you were cruel or crazy or dead. Yes, a single tear ran down his cheek, disappearing into his beard. Because I'd rather have you hate me and be safe than love me and be in danger. The logic was devastating in its simplicity. Marcus had erased himself from existence to sever every connection the Castellanos could exploit. Marcus's disappearance hadn't been random. He'd researched how people fall off the grid, spending late nights reading about identity erasure and surviving without documentation. The day he left, he'd driven his car to a shopping mall 3 hours away and abandoned it in the long-term parking garage. He'd left his phone on a bus heading to another state. He'd thrown his wallet, credit cards, and driver's license into a river. I became a ghost, he said, staring at his empty plate. No digital footprint, no paper trail. I withdrew cash in small amounts for weeks before I left. So I had enough money to survive for a while. Then I moved to a different city and lived in shelters, sleeping in parks when the shelters were full. The first months were the hardest. Marcus had never been homeless before, had never understood the specific skills required to survive on the streets. He'd learned where the soup kitchens were, which churches offered free meals, where you could find relatively safe places to sleep. He'd learned to blend in, to become invisible in the way homeless people are invisible, present but unseen. I worked day labor jobs, he continued, the kind where they pay you cash at the end of the day, construction, mostly. It was ironic using the skills the Castellanos had corrupted to survive as a homeless person. I'd show up at 5 in the morning, work 12 hours moving materials or digging trenches, get paid $70, and then find somewhere to sleep. He'd moved constantly. never staying in one place long enough to establish patterns. Every few months, he'd relocate to a different city, always traveling by bus, always paying cash, always careful to avoid cameras and official documentation. Philadelphia, Richmond, Charlotte, Atlanta, a geography of grief, each city another mile between himself and the life he'd destroyed. The physical part was bad, Marcus said, being hungry, being cold, getting sick with no way to see a doctor. But the psychological part was worse. Every day, I'd think about you. I'd wonder if you were okay, if you'd moved on, if you hated me. I'd imagine the explanations you were creating for why I left, that I'd found someone else, that I'd had a breakdown, that I'd never really loved you. He'd kept a photograph of us, hidden in the lining of his jacket. It was from a trip we'd taken to the mountains 2 years before he disappeared. In it, we're standing on a hiking trail, my head on his shoulder, both of us laughing at something I can't remember now. He'd look at that photograph on his worst days, reminding himself why he was doing this. About a year after I left, I thought, maybe enough time had passed. Marcus said, maybe the Castellanos had forgotten about me. Maybe I could come back, explain everything, and we could figure out a way forward. But when he'd called his parents' house from a payphone, the first contact he'd made since disappearing, his mother had answered crying. She told him federal investigators had been asking questions about him, about the community center project, about potential fraud. The Castellanos, it turned out, were under investigation, and Marcus's name was in the files as a person of interest. That's when I knew I couldn't come back, he said. If I surfaced, I'd have to either cooperate with the investigation, which would put me and everyone I loved in danger, or refuse to cooperate and potentially go to jail. There was no good option, so Marcus had stayed gone, years piled up like fallen leaves. He'd moved back to our city 6 months ago, drawn by some magnetic pull toward the place where his life had ended. He'd known it was risky, but part of him had stopped caring about risk. Part of him had given up. I thought about killing myself, he said quietly, more than once, but I couldn't do that to my family, to you. At least if I was alive somewhere, there was a chance you'd all eventually find peace. I sat in that diner booth, feeling like the world had tilted on its axis. Everything I'd believed about Marcus's disappearance, every angry thought, every hurt feeling, every moment I'd cursed his name had been built on a foundation of incomplete information. He hadn't abandoned me because he was cruel or selfish. He'd abandoned me because he'd thought it was the only way to keep me safe. The investigation, I said, forcing my teacher's brain to focus on practical details. What happened with it? Marcus explained that the federal case against the Castellano organization had been building for years before his involvement. The community center was just one piece of a much larger puzzle involving construction fraud, bribery, and money laundering across multiple states. Investigators had eventually connected the dots, subpoenaing financial records and interviewing contractors. From what I could piece together from news reports, several people did testify, Marcus said, lower-level employees who'd been pressured into participating. They got immunity deals in exchange for cooperation. Some of the Castellanos were indicted. Vincent is in federal prison now. Then why couldn't you come forward? The question burst out of me. If they're in prison, if the organization is broken up, because I was never just a victim, Sarah, I signed those documents. I accepted payment. I met with officials and lied to their faces, yes. I was coerced, but proving that in court would be almost impossible, and even if I could prove it, the legal fees alone would destroy what's left of my family financially. He'd followed the case obsessively from public libraries, reading every news article about the investigation and trial. He'd watched as other participants received varying sentences. Some walked free with immunity. Others got years in federal prison. The determining factor seemed to be cooperation and the ability to afford good lawyers. Marcus had neither. There's also the question of whether all of the organization is really gone. He added darkly, the Castellanos were the public face, but organizations like that have layers. Someone probably took over operations. Coming forward could still put people at risk. I thought about the years Marcus had spent in this limbo, too afraid to come forward, to broken to rebuild. 5 years of living in the margins, watching life continue without him like a ghost haunting his own existence. What about now? I asked. Now that I've found you. Marcus looked at me with an expression that mixed hope and fear. I don't know. I never expected to see you again. I never expected to have this conversation. My mind was racing through possibilities. We could contact a lawyer, find out what Marcus's legal exposure actually was. We could reach out to the FBI agents who'd handled the case, explain the coercion. There had to be options beyond him, living on the streets indefinitely. We need to get you help, I said firmly, real help, legal advice, therapy, somewhere safe to stay while we figure this out. Sarah, he started to protest. No, you spent 5 years protecting me without giving me a choice. Now I'm making a choice. You're not doing this alone anymore. Something in his face cracked the defensive wall he'd built to survive years of isolation. His eyes filled with tears that spilled down his cheeks into his beard. His shoulders shook with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. A place where he'd locked away 5 years of grief and fear and terrible loneliness. I reached across the table and took his scarred hands in mine. They felt different, rougher, older, marked by years of manual labor and survival. But they were still Marcus's hands. He was still the man I'd loved, just carrying wounds I hadn't known existed. I don't know if I can do this, he whispered. Through his tears, you don't have to know. You just have to try. Brenda, the waitress, walked past our table, saw us holding hands and crying, and silently placed a box of tissues next to the sugar dispenser. She didn't say anything, just nodded once and moved on. Another small kindness in a world that had shown Marcus precious few. We left the diner as dawn was breaking over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I called in sick to work, the first time I'd done so in 3 years, and took Marcus to my apartment. He hesitated at the threshold like a vampire waiting for permission to enter, so traumatized by years of existing in public spaces that the concept of private shelter seemed foreign. My apartment was small but cleaner, 1 bedroom in a building that had seen better decades but maintained its dignity. Marcus stood in the middle of my living room, looking lost, like he'd forgotten how interior spaces worked. I showed him the bathroom, gave him clean towels, and left clothes outside the door that had belonged to my brother. While he showered, I made coffee and phone calls. First to my brother, explaining the situation in broad strokes and asking for advice. He was a paralegal and might know attorneys who handled cases like this. Then to my school, arranging for a substitute teacher for the rest of the week. Then to Marcus's mother. That call was the hardest. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the wary hope of someone who'd spent 5 years jumping at phone calls. Double quotes Mrs. Chen, it's Sarah. A pause. Sarah is everything. I found Marcus. He's alive. He's with me. I heard her gasp, heard his father's voice in the background asking what was wrong. He's okay. Well, he's not okay, but he's safe. I'll explain everything, but I wanted you to know he's alive. Her sobs of relief came through the phone, raw and overwhelming. I heard his father take the phone, his voice thick with emotion, asking if it was really true. I confirmed it again and promised to call back with more information once I understood the full situation. When Marcus emerged from the bathroom 40 minutes later, he looked more like the man I remembered. The years hadn't been kind. His face was gaunt, marked by exposure and stress, but clean and clothed. He was recognizably the person I'd loved. He'd trimmed his beard with scissors I'd left out, and his wet hair was combed back from his face. "I called your parents," I said gently. "They needed to know you're alive." He nodded, fresh tears forming. "Thank you." Over the next several hours, we made a plan. My brother connected us with an attorney named Rebecca Ortiz, who specialized in criminal defense and had experience with coercion cases. She agreed to a consultation the following day. I set up a doctor's appointment to address the various health issues. Marcus had been ignoring a persistent cough, chronic pain in his back, potential infections from inadequate hygiene. Marcus slept for 14 hours that first day, his body finally releasing years of survival tension. I sat in a chair watching him sleep, still half convinced he might disappear again if I looked away. When he woke up disoriented in the darkness, I was there to remind him where he was. That he was safe, that he didn't have to run anymore.